My sister crashed Dad's car. My parents blamed me and kicked me out at 16. But when my grandmother died and they sued me for my house, the judge forced them to pay $15K and left them with nothing. I'm 34 years old. I work in commercial construction, and I need to tell this story because what happened last month in court finally closed a shitty chapter that started when I was like 16 years old, when my parents basically decided I wasn't worth anything, compared to my sister Danielle. And no, I'm not exaggerating. You'll see why I say this. The thing is that for as long as I can remember, everything that went wrong in my house was my fault, even though I literally had nothing to do with it. Danielle could do whatever she wanted, and somehow it always ended up being my problem. You know what I mean? It was like living in an alternate reality where the rules of cause and effect simply didn't apply when it came to my sister. Danielle is 2 years older than me, so when I was 14, she was 16. And let me tell you, those years were when things got really bad. Before that, there were already signs, typical stuff, like she'd break something and somehow my parents would assume I'd done it. Or when food was missing from the kitchen, it was because I'd eaten it, even though I'd literally seen her taking cookies into her room. But when we were teenagers, things escalated to another level. Danielle started going out with every problematic guy in the neighborhood. She'd come home late, smelling like cigarettes and alcohol, getting straight bad grades, and my parents would just look the other way. If I came home 5 minutes late from a friend's house, they'd ground me for a month, but she could disappear for a whole weekend, and when she came back, it was all, "Oh, poor Danielle. She must be going through something difficult." The moment that really changed everything, like the complete breaking point, was when Danielle crashed my dad's car. She was 16, had just gotten her license, which, by the way, my parents paid for her driving lessons while I had to learn from YouTube tutorials and practice with my grandma's car. And one night, she took my dad's 2015 Honda Accord, without permission. This was a Friday. I remember it perfectly because I had a science project due Monday, and I was in my room working on it. Around 11 at night, I hear this commotion downstairs, screaming, crying, the full drama. I go down the stairs, and I see Danielle crying dramatically on the couch, my mom hugging her like she was dying, and my dad pacing back and forth, red with rage. Turns out Danielle had crashed the car, destroyed the whole front end. Apparently she was at a party and drove drunk or high or both. I don't know, but the car was completely fucked up. And you know what was the first thing she did when she got home? She said I had given her permission to use the car. She literally made up this story, that I had told her that Dad had given me permission to lend it, and that I'd given it to her. I just stood there like an idiot saying, "What? I can't even drive well yet. Why would I have permission for the car?" But it didn't matter. My dad was so furious. He needed to blame someone, and clearly it wasn't going to be his perfect princess, so he blamed me. He yelled at me that I was irresponsible. How could I think of lending the car, that because of me, they now had to pay thousands of dollars in repairs? Insurance didn't cover much, because Danielle wasn't authorized to drive it, and apparently alcohol was involved. I tried to explain 1,000 times that I hadn't done anything, that I hadn't even left my room all night, but it was like talking to a wall, so they grounded me for 3 months. No phone, no going out, nothing. Danielle went on with her life like nothing had happened. I saw my mom take her shopping like 2 days after the incident. They bought her new clothes and took her to eat at her favorite restaurant because supposedly she'd had a difficult moment and needed emotional support. I spent my time locked in my room wondering what the hell was wrong with my family, because this couldn't be normal, right? It couldn't be normal for your own parents to hate you so much that they'd rather believe any lie from your sister than listen to you. But that wasn't even half as bad compared to what happened next. Like 2 weeks after the car incident, I was at school when they called me to the principal's office. My mom was there, with that face she'd make when she was disappointed, you know? That whole dramatic expression that mothers practice to make you feel like the worst person in the world. I sat down and she told me, "Your father and I have made a decision. You can't keep living with us." I thought she was joking. Seriously. I laughed because it sounded so absurd. I assumed it was some kind of weird psychological punishment. But no. She was completely serious. She said, I was a negative influence on Danielle. Can you believe it? that my irresponsible behavior was affecting the family, and that they'd talked to my grandmother and she'd agreed to let me go live with her. I was 16 years old. 16. They were take me out of the house for something I hadn't even done, to protect my sister, who was the one actually doing everything wrong. I didn't cry in that moment because I was too much in shock. I just nodded like a robot. That night I packed my things. I didn't have much, really. Clothes, my school books, some old photos, my old laptop I'd bought with money I saved from mowing lawns in the summers. My dad drove me to my grandmother's house in his truck. He didn't even talk to me the whole way, just put on music and drove like he was transporting trash he needed to throw out. When we got there, I got out with my 2 suitcases. He got out, took them out of the back, gave them to me, said, "Your grandmother is waiting for you," got in the car, and left. He didn't even go into the house. He didn't even say goodbye or something like, "Take care." He just left. My grandmother, God bless her, she passed away like a year and a half ago, and I still miss her every day. Opened the door before I knocked. She'd been watching through the window. She hugged me and said, "You're going to be okay here with me, honey." And I cried. I cried like a baby in her arms because it was the first time in I don't know how long that someone in my family treated me like I actually mattered. She never believed the lies about me. She always knew my parents were being unfair, but she couldn't do much either because at the end of the day, they were her children. My grandmother was my dad's mom, and there was this complicated family dynamic where she didn't want to cause more problems. Living with my grandmother was the best thing that could have happened to me, honestly. She gave me the guest room, which was bigger than the one I had at my parents' house. She helped me finish high school. She supported me when I decided not to go to college and instead start working in construction. My parents basically stopped existing for me after I left. I'd see them at occasional family events, like Christmas or Thanksgiving at some uncle's house, but it was all superficial. "Hi, how are you? Good, great, bye." They never apologized. They never admitted that maybe, just maybe, they'd been unfair to me. Meanwhile, Danielle kept being the golden star of the family. My parents paid for her entire college, an expensive private college in another state, like $50,000 a year or something like that, plus dorm, plus food, plus everything. They sent her to Europe 2 summers in a row so she could find her path or some motivational bullshit like that. When she finished college barely, it took her 6 years instead of 4 because she failed several classes. My parents bought her a house. Yes, a whole house. It was a small house, like 2 bedrooms in a decent-ish neighborhood, but still, a house that probably cost like $250,000. They bought it for her as a graduation gift. I, meanwhile, was working 2, sometimes 3 jobs. I worked construction during the day, did security shifts at an office building some nights, and on weekends, I helped a friend who had a moving business. I saved every penny I could for years. I lived with my grandmother but paid her rent, even though she didn't ask for it, because it seemed like the right thing to do, and I also paid half of the grocery shopping and utilities. The rest I put in the bank. I didn't go out much. I didn't spend on stupid shit. I had a clear goal, which was to buy my own house, to have something that was completely mine and that no one could take away from me. At around 32 years old, I finally had enough for a down payment on a house. I found this perfect place. A small duplex in a neighborhood that was improving. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, small yard, nothing fancy, but it was mine. Well, it was going to be mine. The buying process was a nightmare because banks ask you for 1,000 documents and requirements, but I finally did it. And here comes the important part of this story. The part that eventually caused all the recent legal drama. My grandmother was so proud of me. She'd cry every time we talked about the house. She said I was the only person in the family who had really worked for what they had. So I had this idea, kind of sentimental I guess, to put her name on the house deed along with mine. It wasn't a financial decision. She didn't put a single cent toward the house. I paid the entire down payment. All the closing costs. Everything. It was purely symbolic, a way to honor her for everything she'd done for me, for giving me a home when my own parents threw me out like garbage. My grandmother cried when I told her what I'd done. She told me I didn't have to do that, but I insisted. For me, it made sense. She was more my mother than my real mother anyway. The guy at the bank and the real estate lawyer explained all the legal implications to me, that technically she'd be co-owner, even though she hadn't paid anything, and I said yes, that was exactly what I wanted. We signed the papers, and officially it was our house, though she kept living in her house and I moved into the duplex. While I was achieving this, things with Danielle were going completely down the drain. Her house, the one my parents had bought her, went into foreclosure because apparently she hadn't been paying the mortgage for like 2 years. How is it possible not to pay when your parents bought you the house? Well, because my brilliant sister had taken out a second mortgage on the house to invest in a business, which obviously failed, and then used that money for who knows what. Probably parties and trips and expensive clothes, because that's what Danielle did. The bank took the house from her. She had to move out. And guess who came to the rescue? Yeah, my parents again. They let her move back in with them, and apparently used their retirement savings to pay off Danielle's debts. I'm talking about like $80,000 that just disappeared. After that, my parents were in a precarious financial situation, and I found out because my aunt, my mom's sister, told me one day when we ran into each other casually at the supermarket. She told me my parents had emptied their savings, that they were struggling with their own payments, and that family should come together in difficult times. I told her that wasn't my problem, that they'd made their choices and I'd made mine. She looked at me like I was a heartless monster, but honestly, I didn't care. I wasn't going to feel sorry for people who never felt sorry for me. Then, like 6 months after I bought my house, my dad calls me. It was weird because he never called me, like we'd gone years without talking directly. He said he and my mom needed to talk to me about something important. I told him I was busy, that we could talk on the phone, but he insisted it had to be in person. I guess something in me still had that stupid hope that maybe they were going to apologize, that maybe after all these years they were finally going to acknowledge what they'd done to me, so I agreed to meet them at a coffee shop. I arrived and there they both were. They looked older than I remembered. My dad had much more white hair, and my mom looked tired. We sat down, ordered coffee. There were like 5 awkward minutes of superficial talk about the weather, and I don't know what else. Then my dad got straight to the point. He said they'd heard I bought a house. He don't know who told them, probably my aunt or some other gossipy relative, and that they were in a difficult financial situation, and that Danielle also needed a place to stay more permanently. So they asked me if they could move into my house. I just sat there processing what they'd just said, because I couldn't believe they had the nerve to ask me that. I told them no. Simple, clear, no. My dad said it was my obligation as family to help them, that they'd raised me, which is technically true, but a generous way to describe what they did, and that I had space in my house. I reminded them that they'd kicked me out at 16, that they'd never supported me in anything, that they'd given Danielle everything while they didn't even give me a thank you, and that my house was mine and they weren't going to live there. My mom started crying, doing all that emotional show she always did, saying I was cruel. How could I turn my back on them? I told them it was exactly what they'd done to me. I got up and left the coffee shop. I thought that would be the end of the matter. How naive I was. My grandmother died like 2 months after that conversation at the coffee shop. It was peaceful. Thank God. She died in her sleep at her house. She was like 84 years old, and her health had been declining. I was devastated. She was literally the only person in my family who had loved me unconditionally, who had supported me when everyone else abandoned me. The funeral was horrible. Seeing my parents there, acting like the main mourners when they barely visited her, made me sick, but I let it go because I didn't want to cause a scene at my grandmother's funeral. What I didn't expect was what came next. Like 3 weeks after the funeral, I receive a certified letter from a lawyer. I open it, and it's a lawsuit. My parents were suing me, claiming they had a right to half of my house because technically my grandmother was co-owner and they were her main heirs according to her will. I read that letter like 5 times trying to understand the logic. Yes, my grandmother had put my parents as her main heirs in her will. That was true. They inherited her house and her other possessions. But my house wasn't hers. I'd paid every cent. Her name was only there symbolically. I hired a lawyer, a woman named Natalie, who was recommended to me by a friend who'd gone through a complicated divorce. We met. I explained the whole situation to her. I showed her all the house purchase documents, the bank, records showing I'd paid for everything, the down payment transfers, everything. She reviewed everything carefully and told me I had a very strong case, that clearly the house was mine and that the fact my grandmother was on the deed didn't change that I'd been the only one who put money in. But she also warned me that these types of cases sometimes get complicated because there are emotional and family components involved. We went to mediation first because the judge required it before going to trial. We all sat in this uncomfortable room, me with my lawyer on one side, my parents with their lawyer on the other, and a mediator in the middle. Their lawyer presented their case, basically arguing that since my grandmother was legal co-owner and they were her heirs, they had a right to her portion of the property. Natalie presented all my documents, showing I'd financed everything. The mediator tried to find middle ground, suggested that maybe I could pay them an amount to compensate their loss, and they'd renounce the claim. I offered them $1,000 just to end the matter. Their lawyer said they wanted $125,000, literally half the value of the house. I told them to go fuck themselves, not in those exact words because we were in formal mediation, but the sentiment was that the mediation ended without agreement. The trial was like 2 months later. Those 2 months were horrible. I couldn't sleep well. I was constantly stressed thinking about the possibility of losing my house, the only thing I'd really achieved on my own. The day of the trial, I arrived early. I put on my only suit I had. Natalie went over with me everything that could happen. We entered the courtroom and there were my parents with Danielle, because, of course, Danielle had to be there too, supporting them. They saw me and no one made eye contact. They just sat on the other side of the room like I was a stranger. The trial lasted all day. Their lawyer presented the argument that my grandmother was legal co-owner and therefore her inheritance included half the house. They brought the will, the house deed, all of that. When it was Natalie's turn, she completely destroyed their argument. She presented all the bank records showing every payment I'd made, testimonies from the bank office confirming I was the only one who'd put money in, emails between my grandmother and me where she thanked me for including her on the deed as a symbolic gesture. She also found the original email I'd sent my grandmother, explaining exactly why I wanted to put her name on it, where I literally said, "This is to honor you for everything you've done for me, not because you're putting money in." The judge listened to everything, asked some questions, and then said he needed time to review the evidence before giving his verdict. We had to wait 2 weeks for the final decision. Those were the longest 2 weeks of my life. No exaggeration. Finally, the day came. We went back to court. The judge came out and read his decision. He said that although technically my grandmother was co-owner on paper, all the evidence clearly demonstrated that I had been the sole financial contributor to the property, that my grandmother's inclusion had been an honorary and symbolic gesture, and therefore the house was completely mine. He dismissed my parents' lawsuit and also ordered them to pay court costs, which were like $15,000 between their lawyer and other legal expenses. My mom started crying dramatically in court when the judge gave his verdict. My dad just sat there staring straight ahead with that face he'd make when he was furious but trying to contain himself. Danielle looked indignant, like she couldn't believe things hadn't turned out how she expected. I just felt this enormous relief. Like my hands were shaking, but it was pure relief, not fear or anxiety, but that finally this was over and I'd won. We left the court and Natalie congratulated me, told me it had been one of the clearest cases she'd handled in terms of evidence. My parents left through another door, I guess to avoid running into me. I haven't seen or spoken to them since, and honestly I have no intention of doing so. I blocked their numbers, blocked them on all social media, told the few relatives I still talk to not to mention anything about them, because I'm not interested. Danielle tried to write to me like a week after the trial, sent me this long message saying I was selfish, how could I do this to our family, that someday I was going to regret it. I read it, laughed, blocked her too. Now I'm focused on my life, on my work, on paying my mortgage, on living peacefully in my house that's completely mine and that no one can take from me. I still think about my grandmother every day. I wish she were here to see how all this ended. I think she'd be proud that I stood up for myself. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, if I should have been more compassionate or something like that. But then, I remember that those people threw me out on the street at 16 years old to protect their favorite daughter. that they never apologized, that they never cared about me until they needed something from me, and any guilt I might feel disappears. I don't owe them anything. And finally, the legal system agreed with me.